27 years ago, a father and his young son drove into the northern woods of Maine for what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, but they never returned. Authorities launched one of the largest manhunts in state history, but no bodies, no campsite, not even a footprint was ever found. The case went cold, swallowed by silence, until years later an abandoned truck and a single photograph revealed a horrifying possibility. They hadn't disappeared by accident. They had been hunted. Tonight, we follow the desperate search of a daughter who refused to stop asking questions, and the terrifying secrets she uncovered buried in the forest. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. In the crisp autumn of 1998, Alan Avery loaded up his old Chevy pickup with his 9-year-old son, Jacob, and headed into the rugged northern woods of Maine. For Alan, these trips were tradition, the kind of father-son ritual that shaped a boy's childhood, teaching him how to cast a line in shallow creeks, drive stakes into cold earth for a tent, and fall asleep beneath a sky painted with stars. Melissa, Alan's teenage daughter, didn't join this time. She had a school event and stayed with her aunt, but she still remembered standing in the driveway, waving as the truck rolled away, her father's hand hanging out the window, Jacob grinning in the back seat. It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend, but they never came home. What followed became one of the most desperate manhunts in Maine's history. Hundreds of volunteers poured into Baxter State Park and the wilderness beyond. Helicopters scoured the treetops, their blades thundering over endless pines. Divers dragged through icy ponds and meandering streams. Yet, not a trace appeared. No footprints, no campsite, no broken branches, just the eerie absence of a truck, a father, and his son. 4 years later, with no leads, no tips, and no hope, the case was officially closed in 2002. The story slipped into local lore, another mystery swallowed whole by the unforgiving forest. Melissa grew older, left her hometown behind, and forced herself to bury the grief. But in the spring of 2005, 7 years after the disappearance, her phone rang. A hiker venturing off-trail near the state park had stumbled upon an abandoned vehicle swallowed by brush and moss. Its license plates had corroded, its paint peeled away by seasons of snow and rain. But the frame was unmistakable, a late 80s Chevy. Search teams swarmed to the site. Inside the glove compartment lay a camping permit dated October 1998. In the back seat sat a small red boot with a Spider-Man patch stitched on the side. Within hours, Melissa was called. By then she was 22, living 3 states away, trying to build a life free from shadows. Yet when she saw the photograph of that truck, her knees buckled. She knew it instantly. Her father's truck. Their truck. The one that had disappeared into the forest without goodbye. She returned to Maine for the first time in years, and though the town looked the same, Melissa no longer was. She no longer trusted in accidents or blamed the wilderness. She wanted truth. At the impound lot, she stood before the rusted shell. Memories rushed back, the windshield shattered, pine needles still woven into the fabric, the metallic tang of decay mixing with the faintest breath of forest air. Then came the photo, discovered wedged beneath the passenger seat. A woman stood before a weathered cabin. Melissa didn't know her, but behind the woman, blurred yet undeniable, was a man in a flannel jacket and cap. His beard was grayer, his face worn by time, but the eyes, they were her father's. On the back was a date, August 2002, 4 years after Alan and Jacob vanished. In that dim garage, Melissa's world tilted. The story she'd been told was a lie. They hadn't simply vanished into the forest. Someone had found them, or taken them. Either way, the silence was broken, and Melissa vowed to follow the truth wherever it led. Her return to Millinocket was surreal. She hadn't set foot there since 1999. The town greeted her with a kind of stillness, its signs weathered, its buildings shrunk by time. She passed the old diner where her father once drank coffee, the empty hardware store he managed, the football field where Jacob once dreamed of playing under Friday night lights. Everything was familiar but smaller, like echoes of a life stolen too soon. The sheriff's office hadn't changed either, its faded bricks, crooked blinds, and the stale smell of old coffee lingering in the air. When Melissa stepped inside, a deputy looked up and froze. "Melissa Avery?" he asked quietly. She nodded. He rose and led her down a narrow hall to a room she remembered from long ago. Inside stood Detective Karen Doyle. Her hair was grayer, her shoulders heavier with years, but her eyes remained sharp. She reached out her hand. "Melissa, I'm sorry it took this long." Melissa gripped it, fighting the tremor in her chest. "I thought this was over," she whispered. "So did I," Doyle admitted, her voice steady, but tinged with something darker. "Until they found that truck." Detective Doyle slid a manila folder across the desk, her hand lingering just long enough to signal the weight of what lay inside. Melissa opened it, and the glossy crime scene photos nearly stole her breath. The Chevy was choked in brush, its back tires flattened, moss curling high around the wheel wells, as though nature itself had tried to bury the secret. Doyle's voice cut through the silence. "That area was searched in 1998. Thoroughly. The truck wasn't there. Someone moved it. The implication hit like thunder. Someone had hidden it. And someone wanted it to be found." Melissa leaned closer. The red boot, Jacob's tiny boot, was still wedged beneath the passenger seat. The glove box contained the old camping permit dated October 10th, 1998, along with a folded photograph that didn't belong to her father's collection. Doyle explained it had been printed in the early 2000s and was too well preserved for chance. Whoever placed it there had done so deliberately. Melissa studied the image. A woman with long, dark hair in a denim jacket, standing before a log cabin with its door ajar. In the shadows of the doorway stood a man, partially turned away, beard scruffy, cap pulled low. Her heart tightened. "Do you believe that's him?" she asked. Doyle nodded. The facial comparison software wasn't absolute, but the eyes didn't lie. The date scrawled on the back, August 2002, confirmed the impossible. 4 years after the disappearance, Alan Avery was still alive. Melissa's throat closed as the thought tumbled out. "What about Jacob?" Doyle hesitated, her voice careful. No photos, no belongings tied to him after 98. Nothing definitive. But that didn't mean he wasn't there. Melissa steadied herself, whispering the only question that mattered. "Who's the woman?" Doyle admitted the state's missing persons records from 2001 through 2003 showed no match. Facial scans came back empty. But then Doyle opened another file. Fingerprints lifted from the truck revealed 2 adult sets. One was Alan's, the other unknown, untraceable in any database. They were now combing through military discharge lists, hunting licenses, even survivalist forums, desperate for a lead. Melissa felt her chest tighten. Someone else had been with them. Someone who may have moved that truck. The weight of the moment pressed down until Melissa suddenly remembered an email from her father the day before they left. He had written about meeting a friend from the trail crew, a woman who lived near the ridgeline. He said it might be a nice stop on their way. Doyle's eyes sharpened. "A woman?" Melissa nodded. "Her name was June. Just June." Doyle pulled a file and flipped through. There it was, June Everett, a field medic once attached to backcountry search and rescue in the late 80s and 90s. She lived alone near the state line, sold her property in 2003, and vanished from public records. Never reported missing. Quiet, elusive, off-grid. Doyle looked at Melissa with gravity. "You think that's her?" Melissa's voice didn't waver. "I think she may be the last person to see them alive." Doyle nodded once, decisively. "Then we start there. We'll trace her properties, overlay trail data, and pinpoint where she lived." Melissa stood, her voice firm and unshaken. "And when we do, we go looking." Outside, the sky sagged heavy with spring rain, the air sharp with the smell of wet pine. Melissa walked to her car, the photograph folded tightly in her pocket. For the first time in years, the past didn't feel like a scar. It felt like a map, and someone had just drawn the next path forward. The road north carried her deeper into memory, past the ghostly shells of ranger stations, fire towers rusting into the earth, and forgotten gas stations with peeling paint and empty shelves. Karen Doyle had marked 3 red circles on the map, each tied to properties once belonging to June Everett. The largest was an off-grid cabin logged as a seasonal research shelter 10 miles beyond the last strip of pavement. No running water, no power lines, no neighbors for miles. That's where Melissa headed first. The deeper she drove into the wilderness, the more the forest seemed to close in, as though it had been waiting years for her return. The drive into the wilderness stretched nearly 2 hours. The road little more than a scar of rutted dirt, broken by fallen branches and the slow reclaim of nature. When Melissa finally broke through the tree line, her chest tightened. The cabin from the photograph stood before her. Its roof sagged. The porch leaned with age. Moss crept up the corners like fingers. But it was unmistakably the same place. She stepped out, boots crunching pine needles, heart hammering as if the forest itself was watching. The front door gave way with a groan, swinging open into stale air tinged with something sharper: use. Dust covered the floor thickly, but a set of narrow footprints carved a deliberate path across it. Inside, shelves stood half empty. A small iron stove rusted in silence, and beside it, a wool blanket still folded neatly on a low bench, as though someone might return. On the floor sat a tin box. Melissa knelt, breath unsteady, and opened it. Dozens of curled photographs spilled across her lap. Landscapes, campfires, candid faces grinning in flannel and baseball caps. But 2 photographs stopped her cold. One was Jacob, no longer 9, but maybe 10, wrapped in a too large hoodie, staring blankly at the camera with a weariness no child should carry. The second showed Alan in the cabin's doorway, axe in hand, not threatening but worn down, his beard fuller, his eyes hollowed. On the back, Winter 2001. Melissa whispered into the silence. They were here. They were really here. She slipped the photos into her jacket, then searched further. A drawer beneath the table revealed a crumpled journal, its pages smeared, but legible enough. The handwriting was uneven, childish, aching. They said not to talk when he's near. I told her, but she said no, talking at dinner. I want to go home. I want my sister. Melissa's throat tightened as she read on. He watches through the trees. Even when he's gone, I know he's close. June said we're safe, but I don't think she knows anymore. I don't think she can stop him. On the final page, a desperate scrawl. She's gone now. He said I can't leave, but I know the way back. I'll wait until the moon is gone. I'll go east. I'll find the river. No name, no date, only a drawing beneath. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, holding hands under a crescent moon. Melissa's hands shook as she closed it. Jacob. It had to be Jacob. The air outside felt too heavy, too aware, as she hurried back to town. At the sheriff's office, Karen Doyle scanned the photos into the system, her face grim. That's them, she confirmed. Forensics will analyze the handwriting, but I'd bet it's Jacob. Melissa pressed forward. What about June? Karen opened another file. June's name had surfaced on a medical license renewal in 2001, tied to a post office box on land owned by Victor Lang. Melissa asked, "Who's Victor Lang?" Doyle's expression hardened. Ex-military, ran a wilderness retreat in the early 90s, disappeared off-grid by 1997. His name had once been linked to Roy Halpern. Melissa froze. Halpern, the man convicted in 1999 on multiple counts of child endangerment, who died in custody a year later. A predator whose network had never been fully exposed. Doyle leaned in. Do I think Alan and Jacob were moved? Yes. Do I think June tried to help them? Probably. But someone didn't want that. Melissa's eyes fell back on the photograph of the cabin. It was no longer just a structure of wood and stone. It was a threshold, a crossroads where lives had split apart, and someone had chosen a darker path. As Melissa dug deeper into Halpern's past, the contradictions grew. On paper, he had been a respected wilderness educator, licensed in 2 states, running survival camps from 1991 through 96. The brochures painted a wholesome picture: smiling boys with fishing rods, tents pitched by clear rivers, healthy meals beside glowing fires. But beneath that facade, something sinister had lived in the shadows. Something that might connect the Avery's disappearance to a far more dangerous web than anyone imagined. Beneath the polished brochures and smiling faces, the truth about Roy Halpern's camps was far darker. A buried network of sealed court documents, accusations that never reached daylight, and parents who stopped asking questions once their sons were gone. Karen slid a thick folder across the table, its tab marked simply Halpern, suppressed. Inside were reports from 1999. 3 boys, all from different counties, accused Halpern of isolating them, forcing them into labor, and breaking them down with psychological abuse. One boy had run away and was never seen again. The other 2 recanted their stories after brief stays in juvenile facilities, their silence as telling as their earlier confessions. Melissa's voice broke the silence. How did he stay open so long? Karen's expression hardened. Money. Connections. The camps were cheap, desperate. Parents signed their kids away, and the state barely looked. And then, another name surfaced. Victor Lang. His name appeared in affidavits as the man handling transport and logistics. Never charged. Always in the shadows. Melissa's chest tightened. So how does this connect to my father? Karen tapped the last page. A handwritten intake form from 1998. Alan Avery's name was there, his signature attached, signing Jacob up for a weekend retreat hosted by Halpern. The location, Victor Lang's property. Melissa's stomach turned. That can't be right. He would never. Yet the signature on the page looked almost too perfect, deliberate in a way her father's hand never was. Forged, or worse, tricked. She turned the page and froze at the campers' list. Jacob, Tyler, Seth, Cody. All under 12. Did they find the others? She whispered. Karen answered quietly. Tyler resurfaced in 2001, living with distant relatives under a new name. He refuses to speak of those years. Seth was adopted by a church family in Oregon, his past sealed away. Cody remains missing. Melissa felt the walls close in. So what was this? Her voice cracked. A fake camp. Just to collect kids? Karen nodded grimly. Halpern, the recruiter, Lang, the operator, and June, the woman in the photo, perhaps trying to intervene once she realized the horror unfolding. "And my father?" Melissa pressed. Karen's pause carried the weight of everything left unsaid. "I think Alan uncovered the truth. Maybe he went there to pull Jacob out. Maybe to confront them. Either way, he stepped into something bigger than he could control." That night, sleep refused Melissa. In her motel room, she stared at the faded cabin photo, the figure in the doorway unmistakably her father, not a man camping with his boy, but a man hunted, hiding. She remembered his last voicemail from 1998, his voice calm, too calm. "Don't worry about us, honey. We'll be back before you even finish your weekend." It sounded now like a goodbye. By dawn, the phone rang again. Karen's voice was clipped, urgent. A new lead, an unlisted parcel of land near Lang's property, bought in cash in '97, absent from the original records. No permits, no mapped road. "You think it's another site?" Melissa asked. "It's worth checking." By mid-afternoon, Melissa, Karen, and 2 deputies hiked in from the ridgeline. There was no trail, only thorns, underbrush, and stretches of rusted barbed wire marking forgotten borders. After nearly an hour, the forest opened into a clearing. At its center stood a shed, small, crude, newer than the cabin. Inside, the air was thick with mildew, heavy with rot. Hooks lined the walls, chains draped from corners, a rusted cot hunched against the back. The mattress was long gone. Carved deep into the wooden floor was a single word: run. Melissa stumbled back, her chest heaving. "This wasn't a retreat," she whispered. "This was a prison." Karen scanned the perimeter with sharp eyes. "They moved him through here." Maybe stayed for a while. Her gaze dropped to the carved word. Someone left that for a reason. That night, Melissa replayed Jacob's desperate words from the torn journal. "She's gone now. He said I can't leave." June. Had she tried to save them? Or had she vanished because of it? Either way, the silence of the forest was no longer empty. It was complicit. If those pages were Jacob's handwriting, now Melissa felt certain, they meant he had escaped, or at least tried. Somewhere beyond that shed, past the single carved plea on the floor, he had chosen east toward the river, and that desperate childish map of stones and marks might be the trail he left. So they followed it, trusting memory and instinct more than the outdated map Detective Doyle carried, pushing through brambles that shredded sleeves and through soggy earth that tried to swallow boots, until Karen stopped and pointed to a deliberate stack of 5 stones ringed with pine cones. Trail signs, Melissa realized, but oddly specific, too planned for casual hikers. Then, 15 minutes later, a line of 4 stones pointed east, and beneath dead leaves lay a small red glove with a faded Spider-Man logo. Jacob's glove, dropped on purpose like a breadcrumb, and as they moved on, they found more marks. Crescent moons and single, vertical slashes carved into bark. A crude river sketch leading them finally to a bluff that yawned over a wide bend of the Penobscot River. The very river that threads central Maine and windows into the state's wild heart. Standing there, the vista was both cruel and beautiful. This was where a terrified 9-year-old might stand alone and measure the impossible. And Melissa thought of how her father had taught Jacob to read currents and to raft. How knowledge can be a lifeline and not a guarantee. And when Karen warned that there was no bridge and swimming would be dangerous, Melissa answered that he had been trained and that she believed he'd tried. Kneeling at an old tree's roots, she pried loose a dented canteen with faint initials, J.A., and it confirmed the impossible. He had been here. He had reached this bluff. They hiked back heavy with that truth, And that night in Karen's office, the team reconsidered the carvings. Not merely directions, but warnings. The repeated crescents clustering near the midpoint between the cabin and the river suggesting someone was watching or hunting him. If someone tracked Jacob, it fit the other horrors they'd found. Chains and the carved run in the shed, signs that this was not flight from place but flight from a person. And the next morning, the K9 team hit a pocket of scent near a rocky slope, where, beneath stones, mostly animal bones lay alongside a rusted spoon, a cracked mirror, and a plastic-sealed notebook whose frantic, jagged lines read like a child. Learning how to survive. I sleep in trees now. I wait until I don't hear his boots. I move when the birds stop. I drink from the stream. I dream of pancakes. I dream of home. I dream of you, Melissa. And then the darker line that followed. He caught the girl, not me. She screamed for hours. I covered my ears. I think he thought I was gone. I wasn't, which tore the last of Melissa's defenses away and turned hope into a hard, urgent promise. If Jacob had lived long enough to scratch directions into bark and stash a glove and a canteen, she would trace each mark, follow every crescent moon, and face whatever hunted him until she found the place where he had either crossed the water or where the trail had ended. Because the map his fear had drawn was now the only map she trusted. Melissa looked up and the notebook fell silent between them. Another voice. A girl's, Karen said softly, which meant maybe she was the one who didn't make it. Or maybe she was the one who moved the truck. Melissa closed the notebook carefully, feeling the weight of that folded confession in her palm, and for the first time, the slope below them seemed less like an empty wood and more like a ledger of small decisions and desperate plans, every carved crescent and stacked pebble a sentence in a child's escape note that someone had nearly erased with time. Jacob had documented everything the only way he could, quietly, secretly, in symbols, half buried under needles and leaves. And now other ears were listening, which meant the forest's silence no longer owned the truth. So when Karen ran a query through old missing person databases from 1998 to 2003, she filtered for young girls in counties bordering Lang's Land and sifting through dozens of dead ends, found one file that would not let her go. Nora Green, 10 years old, reported missing in late 1999, last seen hiking with foster parents near the East Ridge trailhead, less than 10 miles south of the cabin's region. The report read like so many others. Vague circumstances, a claimed wandering off during a rest stop, an initial search that dwindled as the family moved away. But something in Nora's file matched the journal's rhythm. Her age, the rough time frame, the way no one seemed to push. And Melissa stared at Nora's grainy photo. Wide-set eyes and shoulder-length curls, a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and asked aloud the question that had begun to blacken every file they opened. If she was taken, why didn't anybody keep looking? Karen's answer was blunt. Kids like Nora fall through cracks or are quietly pushed aside. And then she slid a paper across the desk showing Victor Lang's name tied to Nora's case in 2000, offering volunteer search assistance while his own property remained unsearched, which stung Melissa with the bitter realization that he had likely known where Nora was all along. She whispered that maybe Nora and Jacob had crossed paths at the camp and tried to escape together, that he had caught her and Jacob had run. And the thought settled like a stone in her chest. The next day, they followed the markers again, but veered south toward Nora's last known coordinates and found a new symbol carved into bark, a crescent moon surrounded by 4 vertical slashes, unfamiliar but deliberate. And beneath a jutting flat rock, a rusted tin lunchbox held a cracked ceramic pendant and a pencil-scrawled note barely legible. If anyone finds this, my name is Nora. I was here. I tried to leave. I don't know where Jacob is. I hope he got out. I think I'm being watched again, which proved she had been alive long enough to hide a trace, and that she had tried to leave a breadcrumb of her existence. Karen's fingers trembled as she realized the note was not just a record, but a warning. She had changed the symbol, because she knew his hunting pattern and tried to speak a new language of marks to confuse him, and Melissa, looking at the new carving, felt a cold clarity. There might be more signs, more names, more children who had learned to write in stone and bark, and that the path forward would require reading each mark as both map and testimony, following every crescent moon and stack of stones until the trail ended or until it led them to the people who had turned places of learning into places of terror. Because if Nora had left her necklace and a note under a rock, then she had been both witness and victim, and Melissa now understood that rescuing a memory could be the only way to save whatever sliver of justice was left for those who never came home. More signs, more warnings, Melissa murmured, and Karen agreed. They would need to retrace every step, every tree and clearing, because Nora might have left a trail of her own. That afternoon, a forensic mapping team flew drones over the wilderness, overlaying satellite scans with each known marker: the crescent moons, the stacked stones, the crude etchings. A pattern began to form. Jacob's trail ran west to east, Nora's south to north, and both converged at the shed before splitting again. They were held together, Karen said quietly, then separated. Two escape paths, Melissa's voice trembled but held. Jacob reached the river. Maybe Nora made it further north. Karen's finger traced a point on the digital map. There's one place we've overlooked, a collapsed hunting cabin logged in 2000. It burned in 2003. No official report, just an incident note from a ranger named Everett Melissa's breath caught. June. She was still active then. Barely. And then she vanished. Karen marked the coordinates. We go at first light. That night, Melissa lay awake, ceiling blank above her, replaying the images of Jacob's glove, Nora's note, two children who had fought to be remembered. By dawn, they reached the burn site. The forest greeted them, with silence so heavy it pressed against their skin. The trail had been swallowed, but the scar of the cabin remained. Blackened stones in a broken outline, nails curled in the dirt, and the smell of old ash clinging stubbornly after years. Karen crouched near the thickest remains. Burned hot here? Not an accident. No controlled permit either. Melissa stared at the charred beams. Someone erased something, or someone their search turned methodical. Near the ruin's edge, Melissa brushed away soil and uncovered a warped metal tag. The name was still etched: Everett. June's claim, proven. A few feet further, her hand closed around a melted hair clip, child-sized pink plastic, its edges bubbled by fire. Nora. It had to be hers. Beneath a collapsed beam, they uncovered a rusted cot frame and hinges to a trap door, its iron scorched but intact. With effort, Karen and a deputy pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase of concrete leading into black. The air that rose was cold and wet, carrying the heavy scent of mildew and thyme. Their flashlights swept across rotted shelving in the underground space. In the center, a single object waited: a metal lunchbox, intact, despite the years. Melissa's fingers shook as she opened it. Inside were three objects: an undeveloped roll of film, a matchbook from a long-closed diner in Millinocket, and a torn workbook page covered in crayon. The words, shaky but unmistakable. If I go and no one knows, maybe someone someday will find this. Karen exhaled, her voice low. She left it for us. Melissa's reply was barely audible. No, she left it for anyone. She wanted to be remembered. Karen pressed the film into a deputy's hand. Rush this to processing. Back above ground, they widened the search radius. 100 yards north, something caught the light. A cairn of stones. Deliberate, not natural. Around it, a ring of charred bark, like a boundary marked in fire. And with that discovery, Melissa realized the forest was not just a graveyard of secrets. It was a map still speaking, if they were willing to follow. Beneath the cairn, they unearthed a small cloth pouch. Inside, a tooth, a key, and a locket emptied of its photograph. And the quietness of that discovery hit Melissa like a punch. These were keepsakes someone had hidden to remember or to prove existence, and when she turned the tiny key, she found it stamped with L02, a camp locker tag the team recognized from Halpern's operation, which meant that if locker codes were still assigned the same way, that tag would have belonged to Jacob as the second child enrolled that week. So Nora had kept it, maybe to remember him, maybe to prove he had been real, and the implication hardened Melissa's resolve. Later that afternoon, the film came back from the lab mostly ruined by heat, but 2 frames survived. One a blurred but unmistakable shot of Jacob and Nora sitting tired on a rock, faces raw with endurance, the other a profile of June frozen in a look of absolute dread near the cabin. And that image confirmed what the scattered traces already suggested. These people had been here together, and then they had been separated. This, Melissa thought, was the last place they'd been seen as a group. As the team layered evidence and testimony into a single map, patterns hardened into direction. Jacob's marks trended west to east until they met the river, while Nora's carved route ran south to north and crossed his at the shed. 2 escape paths from one nightmare. They widened their search, and at a burned-out hunting cabin with blackened foundations and twisted nails, they pried open a scorched trapdoor into a root cellar where a child's lunchbox preserved a pencil-scrawled pledge. If I go and no one knows, maybe someone someday will find this, and beside it a brittle workbook page that read like a deliberate record of being watched, which proved she had been alive long enough to hide a record and to change her carved symbols so a hunter might miss her trail. Above ground, they found melted pink plastic hair clip fragments and a warped metal tag engraved Everett, linking that ruin to the ranger who had logged odd reports, Everett June, and suggesting someone had tried to silence warnings. The following morning, the forensic mapping team used drone scans and satellite overlays to plot every symbol, rock pile, carving, and artifact. The resulting pattern made the horror clearer. Jacob's breadcrumb trail through the woods ended at a bluff overlooking the broad bend of the Penobscot River, New England's great river that runs through central Maine and threads the region's wild heart. So when Melissa stood on that bluff, she understood both its beauty and its cruelty, because it was a place a frightened 9-year-old might reach and know the swimming would be deadly, even if his father had taught him to read currents and raft. They recovered a dented canteen with faint initials, J.A., confirming he had been there. Back in town, the DA's office failed them, coldly dismissing renewed action for lack of living witnesses or immediate remains, and the way the assistant prosecutor spoke about statutes, resource allocation, and past federal involvement only hardened Melissa's suspicion that the legal system had been outplayed or intimidated. She pushed and learned of an unlisted parcel bought in cash in the late 1990s near Lang's property, learns that Lang's name surfaced again and again around transport and logistics, that Roy Halpern's camps had a paper-bright face covering darker allegations, and that many kids, Tyler, Seth, Cody, and now maybe Nora, had been shuffled into new identities or vanished into silence. The burned cabin, The piecemeal evidence, the deliberate carved crescents and changed symbols all combined into a single, ugly truth. This was organized, predatory, and hidden in plain sight. Melissa felt something shift, from grief to furious clarity. These small objects, these carved moons, these altered symbols, and the single carved word run were not just proof of presence, but a map and a set of testimonies written by children who had no other way to speak. Nora's note and the lunchbox meant she had been both witness and resistor, burying her necklace, changing a symbol to warn others, recording her name in hope. And the discovery of that key, stamped L02, tied a child's locker to a system that had funneled kids into a network of camps and off-grid properties where people like Lang and Halpern operated with impunity. Now, Melissa had photographic frames, handwriting samples, GPS coordinates, and a growing list of names. And she carried all of it like a weapon to the courthouse, the weight of the folder pressed to her chest, determined to force attention where bureaucracy and fear had preferred silence. Because whether or not the town, the DA, or powerful men wanted the past to stay buried, the forest's little language of stones and slashes, of gloves and canteens and charred hair clips, had spoken loud enough to demand an answer, and Melissa would read every mark until someone finally told the truth. Melissa's hands trembled as she flipped through the family album and found Harold Avery, stiff, suited, smiling beside her father at a barbecue in the early 1990s. And the image landed like a verdict. Her father had always seemed wary of his brother, and now every small, quiet decision from years ago read like complicity. The following day, Karen's request to unseal the court records tied to Halpern's conviction was denied, locked down by a judge who ruled them permanently sealed under vague state protective interests. And that denial tasted like a warning that power could still bury the past. That night, an anonymous package arrived at Melissa's motel with a photograph of a terrified girl in the woods, a typed note. They never stopped, only moved, and a hand-drawn map marked with Jacob's carved moons and lines, all converging on an old ranger outpost labeled W8, a decommissioned station whose coordinates matched the newly plotted pattern. So they packed the Jeep and drove into the tangle of abandoned logging roads toward a structure barely breathing beneath moss and rot near Millinocket, Maine, a real gateway to Baxter State Park and the region they'd been searching, its name and position confirmed, where the outpost's collapsed roof and warped boards felt like a stage set for something deliberately erased. Inside the ruin, they found scorched black foundations, a scorched trapdoor, and below, cold concrete steps down into a mildew-thick cellar where a metal lunchbox preserved a roll of film, a matchbook from a closed diner in Millinocket, and a crayon-scrawled workbook page that read like a plea, "If I go and no one knows, maybe someone someday will find this, proof that a child had tried to leave a map of their own survival." And when the film was rushed to processing, most frames were melted by heat, but two survived, a blurred, aching shot of Jacob and Nora sitting together on a rock, and another of June in profile near the cabin with terror on her face. Images that stitched together the fact they had all been together there. Melissa carried the evidence to the county DA, hoping the law would act, only to be fobbed off with talk of statutes, resource limits, and old federal inquiries that had found nothing actionable, which only deepened her suspicion that the rot reached higher than she'd dared imagine. Standing with the sealed files, the anonymous map, and those fragile photos, Melissa felt the story sharpen from rumor to indictment. Someone had used power and silence to bury these children, but the forest's carved moons, stacked stones, dented canteens, and a child's secret notebook had become a chain of testimony she could follow. And if the courthouse refused to open, She would follow the map W8 marked until it led her to whatever men had turned sanctuary into trap. Melissa unfolded June's pages and realized the voice wasn't Jacob's at all, but June's, a confession and a plea. She hadn't brought them there to be harmed, she said. She'd tried to hide and help them, and her notes named Jacob's quickness with the land and Nora's fading hope as if cataloging their last strengths. Then, while circling the ruined outpost, they found fresh, heavy boot prints around a recent fire pit, proof someone didn't want the place discovered. And that night, the motel floor became a shrine of evidence. Photos, journals, the map, June's letter. Each fragment nudging them toward a single, dangerous truth. If Jacob kept moving northeast, there was only one place left. No one had meaningfully searched, the caves near Tumbledown. And though local trail lore and maps identify the well-known Tumbledown Mountain and its ridge trails in western Maine, often called Tumbledown Ridge, that wilderness is remote and treacherous, and the only area that matched the old ranger notes they'd found. At dawn, they pushed out with deputies and a climbing expert. Steep, unstable approaches, jagged cliffs streaked with black mineral seams, and at the base, a concealed entrance behind brambles that opened into a soot-streaked cave where small, deliberate marks, moons, arrows, cryptic codes had been scratched into stone, matching Jacob and Nora's symbols. Inside, a tin box held a torn dictionary page with circled words: trust, run, hide. Alongside, a scrap of Spider-Man red fabric and items clearly left as a child's testimony. Proof Jacob had been here, proof they'd been trying to be found, and proof someone had been hunting them. They pushed deeper through tight chambers until a larger hollow opened and the smell of old smoke and human sorrow hit them. There they found bones that looked animal-sized, but beside them a tin with a crayon, note and a child's fabric, Jacob's breadcrumb of life, and counting carved notches on a wall and a cramped notebook with frantic lines led Melissa to a brutal conclusion. These children had survived longer than anyone imagined, leaving behind a map of marks and keepsakes, so someone might one day trace their steps. With each new item, June's confession, June's dread in the photo, the fresh prints, the charred hair clip, the camp-tagged key stamped L02, the pattern of organized abuse and local complicity hardened. And Melissa felt the quiet inside her turn into steel. They would follow the caves, the ridge, and every carved moon until they either found Jacob and Nora or exposed the men and the system that tried to bury them. The tunnel tightened until they moved single file, shoulders scraping stone, the air pressing cold and close, and then the deputy's voice cut through the dark. "You need to see this." Where a shaft of light from a collapsed ceiling revealed a flattened sleeping bag, and beside it, a child's drawing. 2 stick figures, a cabin, a crescent moon, Jacob's story rendered in crayon, and a sun-faded plastic toy that matched Nora's intake file. Proof they'd been together. Below that, a deeper shaft was boarded over as if someone had tried to hide it, and when Melissa volunteered to descend, she found not natural caverns, but a square concrete bunker, man-made walls, empty shelves, and, in the center, a box of Polaroids, so damning they felt like nails. Children asleep, children crying, each shot haunted by the same blurry figure in a flannel jacket lurking in the background. And one Polaroid froze Melissa's breath. Jacob, older, hollow-eyed, wearing the same jacket from the burned cabin photo, a picture dated after 2001 that meant he had lived on long after the official search ended. Then gravel shifted above, footsteps that were not theirs, a ghostly signal that someone else still moved in these tunnels. And when they climbed back out, the shaft had been carefully closed again, as if to erase their presence. which only proved the point. Whatever or whoever had hidden these rooms knew they were being found. They slept badly that night. The Polaroid and the child's drawing folded close to Melissa's chest, and at dawn the team returned with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. Equipment and instincts honed to find what time and fire had tried to bury. And in the cooler, damper depths, they found a second rusted door with hinges eaten by age. When Karen pried it open, the next chamber exhaled decades of stale air and revealed a cramped, deliberate space where someone had left a tin with torn dictionary pages circled on words like trust, run, and hide, a scrap of Spider-Man red, and notches on the wall counting days. All the childish, shivering proof that someone had been there and had tried to speak an entire story in tiny artifacts. The bunker was not the end, but the middle. Polaroids proved a system, footsteps proved a watcher, the closed shaft proved an effort to conceal, and Melissa felt the axis of grief tip toward action. They would go deeper, follow the marks and the photos, and face whatever guarded these rooms until the truth in the dark was dragged into the light. The tunnel narrowed to a suffocating crawl, its walls too even, too intentional, and then opened into a chamber that looked untouched by time. In the center stood a cot, a crate, and a lantern still upright, proof that someone, Jacob, had lived there after the bunker. Carved into the stone wall were words cut deep, a child's desperate script. Melissa, I tried. Her knees gave out as she traced the grooves. He had believed she would come. In the crate, they found canned food, a cracked water jug, and a photograph wrapped in cloth. Jacob alone by the river clutching a slingshot, and behind him the blurred figure in flannel. Closer than ever, always following. On the back of the photo, Jacob's pencil, plea. If you find this, he didn't get me yet. I'm still moving. Don't stop, Karen whispered. He believed in you. He held on for years, Melissa answered softly. Not always. Nora was with him, at least for a time. Above ground, one of the cadaver dogs barked frantically near a stand of pines. Beneath tangled roots, they uncovered a tarp bundle with a shredded child's backpack, and, inside, the last notebook. The entries were frantic, jagged. He's close. I hear him when I sleep. Sometimes he whispers my name. Sometimes it's not even him. But I keep moving. I keep the light hidden. The final page stopped her breath. If I don't make it, don't stop looking for the others, for the girl. They took her again. She screamed for a long time. But maybe she's still out here. Maybe we both are. Melissa sat back, voice raw. He didn't die here. Not then. Maybe not ever. That night, restless, she carried the notebook, the drawing, the Polaroid back to the ridge alone. At the cave mouth, wind howled through the trees as she laid them on a stone like offerings. You mattered, she whispered. You weren't lost. The woods gave no reply but silence, the heavy kind that follows answers or precedes them. When she returned, Karen was waiting with one more lead. There's one place we haven't searched, she said, pointing to the far edge of their makeshift map. The cold place where even the birds don't sing. Jacob had named it once. The quarry, sealed in 2004, never investigated. Melissa nodded. Then that's where this ends. Or begins. The old quarry was a scar in the land, fenced with rusted gates and warning signs. Unstable ground, risk of collapse. Melissa stepped past them anyway, the air hollow, the overcast sky pressing low. They followed the southern rim into a basin of broken stone, where a rusted door crouched behind shrubs. Not on any map, older than the quarry itself. Karen brushed, back branches, tried the handle. Welded shut once, she muttered. But someone broke it open. They exchanged a look, then pushed it wide. Beyond, a staircase fell into the stone, vanishing into the earth like a throat waiting to swallow them whole. Cold air clung to them as the stairwell sank into stone, each step heavier than the last, until the lights flickered on by motion sensors that should not have worked after so many years. The corridor ended in a concrete chamber lined with metal doors, each stenciled with numbers: L01, L02, L03. Melissa's pulse quickened. Locker tags, just like the key Nora had hidden. Karen opened the first, empty. The second, chains and dust. The third, bedding, child-sized shoes, drawings pressed into the walls. Melissa whispered, "They lived in these. For how long?" And then came L08. Inside lay a bundle of clothes, a small journal, and bones delicate as twigs. Karen's voice was taut. "DNA will tell us." But Melissa already knew. The journal was Jacob's. His final words spilled across the page. "She's gone again." I waited, but she didn't come back. I think he found her. Maybe he found me too. I hear his steps in my dreams, but I'm not afraid. I saw Melissa once in the light. She looked older, but she smiled. That means I'm close. I think I'll stay here now, in the quiet. Melissa placed her palm against the wall where Jacob had carved one last vow. Still trying. She whispered back, "He made it this far." He left a trail. He left everything. Karen's hand settled on her shoulder, grounding the moment. So others could find him. So you could. They emerged into the cold daylight, the quarry wind cutting sharp as memory. Melissa turned once toward the rusted door, knowing behind it lay more than remains. A boy who never stopped moving, a girl who never stopped hoping, a woman who tried to shield them, and a faceless predator whose shadow stretched through every broken trail. Days later, the DNA results confirmed it. Jacob Avery. The report read, "Exposure and malnutrition." But Melissa knew the truer cause: abandonment, silence, the failure of those who had power but looked away. She held a small memorial, but grief hardened into fire. She sought out the families of other missing children, shared the map, the journals, the evidence, giving names to those erased and hope to those still searching. In time, she became the voice her brother had never had, a relentless echo in the wilderness. And on certain nights, when the wind swept through the trees, Melissa swore. She could hear Jacob's laughter, still running, still alive in story, beside a girl few remembered, at the edge of the forest where tragedy becomes legend. And legends, whispered long enough, could sometimes lead the living back to the truth. Jacob's trail ended in silence, but not in defeat. Through his notes, drawings, and symbols carved into stone, he left behind proof of life, a map of survival, and a voice that still echoes through the trees. His sister Melissa turned that voice into action, fighting for other families, refusing to let their children vanish without a trace. And though the forest still holds secrets, one truth remains unshaken. Legends are born when the lost refuse to be forgotten. If this story moved you, share it, leave your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe, because the next truth we uncover might change everything you thought you knew.